Okay. So going back to the external and the internal world point. So one of the jobs that the brain has to do is to make predictions about reality, to make sense of things, and to assess what was expected against reality. And a similar kind of process of hypothesizing applies to the self as well. So there's one person that talks about the self model or the working self, which is more of a cognitive science way of talking about this, the self model. I like to think more in narrative terms as the self reading system, that we are thinking about ourselves either implicitly or explicitly as we go along. So for example, I chose that famous meme because maybe when you came across the 9-dot problem, if it was for the first time, you were thinking, oh my God, I'm not good at these things, and you start feeling heart palpitations and panic. So your ways of reading yourself are part of what you're bringing to the situation. And that's also something that keeps on changing. So when we have flexible feedback loops to reality, we're able to modify our predictions. When we have flexible self-reading systems, we're able to change the ways in which we see ourselves and grow and reinterpret our behavior and not be stuck in fixed ideas about ourselves as being useless at something, or all our kind of negative self-beliefs. So there's a very therapeutic element to this ability to break frame. So maybe what would breaking frame mean in yourself? What fixed idea of yourself have you had for a very long time that maybe is wrong, maybe is fundamentally wrong? So this is obviously part of our therapeutic processes and our coaching, is helping people to change their fixed self-beliefs that are very inhibiting, which constrain them and which stop them from joining the dots in a way that's going to be helpful for them. So let's go to another puzzle. See if you can do some of these. Choose a couple of these. See if you can take them on. Who wants to have a go at telling us the answer to one of them? Audrey, you unmuted. I'm picking on you.
I'm not. I was not unmuted, and I was wasn't paying full attention, so I'm not sure what your question is.
Okay, I'm gonna let you off the hook. These puzzles here. Anybody who wants to volunteer and answer for one of them. So I'll do one to kick us off. So number 9, once upon a time. Who's gonna jump in and volunteer? What about
Number
11?
2.
Try to understand.
Jack in the Box.
Who's Corin? Are you unmuted?
I said number 2, Jack in the Box.
And I say number 6, blood is thicker than water.
Yeah.
And somewhere over the rainbow, number 3.
Yeah.
And number 17.
Let's go one at a
I
time.
Number 10 is green eggs and ham.
Yes.
Number 16 is apple pie.
Awesome.
What?
Number 15, one in a million.
Yeah, one in a million. Think outside the box. 6 feet underground.
The box.
So you can
23 is half baked.
Number 12.
Ice cube.
Number 4, back door.
Okay.
Number
brilliant.
22, too big to ignore.
So you
Number
get the
5,
picture. So did you notice
Yes.
that you had to slightly modify your thinking in approaching these puzzles, and that maybe you had an experimental process going on of, until something clicked. I'm sure you noticed that. And you already knew that my talk is about breaking frame and thinking differently. So maybe you knew that you were going to be given something that forced you to do that. But the point of this is being able to self-read in the moment. So what did you think the minute I put that slide in front of you? What was your cognitive process? What kinds of things did you tell yourself about the puzzles themselves and then about yourself? So did you think, oh my God, this is so confusing, what the hell is this? Or did you think, oh, cool? How did you experience yourself? Did you experience anxiety about the fact that you think you're not good at this stuff? Or did you feel enthusiastic because you know that you're going to get it? So this is very, very important, not just for solving big problems. It's important for learning. It's important for being able to adapt, be persistent, your agency, your self-efficacy. So your thoughts about yourself are going to have a major impact on how you approach a tiny problem like this and, much bigger problems of every scale. And enhanced self-awareness allows us to approach things in new ways. So here I'm going into some of the models of self-awareness. So this is Cook-Greuter giving an integration of some of the themes across models. And so it's not just about solving little puzzles. It's about wisdom and effectiveness in the world, being able to see things from a more complex and dynamic perspective. So those of you who've worked with integral theory and Ken Wilber are going to recognize these things straight away. So the complexity and dynamism of our perspectives change, and we become able to describe and articulate more of reality in more differentiated and more integrated ways. And our thinking becomes more flexible. So these are some of the things that are pointed out in these vertical development models. And, again, you have to relativize the models because and I'm going to get to that in a second. This was Nora Bateson, beautifully synchronistically spotted one of her comments on Facebook last night. Stage theory is bullshit and colonial as hell. So even while we might love these models and constructions of the mind and of reality and of how we engage with them, let's also be aware that they're overlays on our phenomenological experience. And where do they come from? Who made this stuff up? That's what I like to ask with the Enneagram. Who made this stuff up? Where does it come from? Who told you? So that we don't get stuck in seeing ourselves in a particular way. And people laugh at me because I'm such an Enneagram junkie and I teach it and it's my whole life. But at the same time, let's just relativize it and hold it at a distance, because it comes from somewhere, and that somewhere is not an accident. It's called California in the 60s. And a lot of those teachers were taking a lot of drugs. Sorry, Enneagram fans. But it's got a particular cosmology behind it. So if we look a little bit more deeply at these stage models and models of what we kind of think of in terms of a kind of upgrade in our consciousness, I like to use the metaphor of mapping. We've got a map of reality and it's outdated. In systems like the Enneagram, our reality map is something that we formed in early childhood, and it's got a lot of distortions in it. Dragons over the edge of the world, things like that. And as we become more construct aware, more aware of our own ways of thinking, we're able to develop more accurate maps of the world. So I'm aware of the time that I've been going for an hour, and I'm definitely going to keep going on. I want to see if anybody really needs to drop off now and has a question that they want to squeeze in. I can do that, but I really want to keep going on laying the foundations. Mona, is that you? Okay, any questions at this point?
Ingrid,
Who's unmuted?
yeah, Ingrid, I'm not seeing any hands go up at this point. I myself will have to leave at 2 o'clock, but
Okay,
that doesn't matter because you guys can keep going.
okay.
So I don't see any hands. So I think perhaps just move on. I think
Okay,
we're all just in.
brilliant. Okay, cool. So all of these models say that the more self-aware we become of how our world is constructed and what constructs we're using, we become more capable of realistic self-appraisal, a whole lot of other normative values in these models about how our life improves and how much more self-efficacy we have and how much better we're able to relate to people. So that's a really common thread, is that as we upgrade our consciousness, things improve in multiple domains. And anybody who works in the healing professions or as a coach is going to be working from this basic foundation. This basic idea is that changes in consciousness are possible and they're beneficial. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing that work, and neither would your clients be coming. So this is the underlying idea, is that there's a movement towards some kind of self-actualization, higher state of consciousness. No, all of those things are fundamental assumptions about human nature, that there is this growth and potential involved. And then again, I'm using these 3 dimensions of experience, and this is something that comes out in Cook-Greuter as well, and these other models, is that this progression and elevation of consciousness, whatever metaphor you want to use, Viveki speaks about anagogy, he pronounces it, which is this process of elevation of perspective, where we're able to get a bigger picture perspective that is more differentiated and more integrated, that playing out in these 3 domains. So as we become more evolved in our thinking, I know, every word is metaphorical and laden, and we're able to change those old maps to be more objective. And how does this happen? So Viveki speaks about the evolution of psychotechnologies since the late Paleolithic, and it's absolute pleasure to listen to him talking about this. But he speaks about the emergence of symbolic tools that are an extension of our cognition. So if you think about your diary app, and it's an extension of your brain, you don't have to remember all your appointments. You've got an app where you can take that thinking and keep it. So that's one of the analogies, is that we develop a lot of psychotechnologies and as an extension of our cognition. Literacy is an example. We're born illiterate. It's a psychotechnology that's developed over millennia for us to be able to communicate intergenerationally. So I can read Chaucer and make inferences about human nature based on, literature. Science, things are intergenerationally communicable because of literacy. So that's one psychotechnology. And psychotechnologies are defined as anything that enhances our cognitive capabilities. It's like a software on the hardware of our brain. You could call it thoughtware. So this is the idea that some of these self-reading systems, like the Enneagram, I like to think of it as a psychotechnology. How does it enhance our ability to read ourselves? Why is it useful? And, it's one among many psychotechnologies that we've got. So we've got psychotechnologies for helping us think about complexity, systems. There's the Myers-Briggs. It's a psychotechnology for helping us understand ourselves and each other. And some of these psychotechnologies really empower what is called epistemic transformation. So it changes what we think is knowledge. It changes how we see the world fundamentally. It changes how we see our relationship to the world and what then becomes possible. So it's a fundamental overhaul of our perspective on ourselves, on life, and how we relate to life. And this is why things like the Enneagram are so important, because people who work with it and have been working with it will know how fundamentally it's changed their perspective on reality. And, most people who have that encounter and start working with it experience it as incredibly empowering and wonderful. And not many people say, oh my God, that thing's a waste of time. I wish I'd never discovered it. I don't know if I've ever met anyone who said it's a waste of time. So it has a fundamental impact on how we view ourselves. And, there are a whole lot of ethical implications for that as well, for the practitioners that I go into in this PhD later on. And the change in the salience landscape is what I keep going on about. And the salience landscape is like a map telling us what to look out for. Here we go. So it's a configuration of meanings that tell us what to notice. So if you look at the Cynefin framework, it tells us to think of reality in terms of 4 types of contexts. The Enneagram tells us to think about ourselves in terms of 27 subtypes and the dynamics between them. So we start reading ourselves according to those categories and joining those dots. So a salience landscape picks out aspects of reality and it preempts what we look at. So in my interviews with people, when I ask them about their self-observation process, I'm paying attention to whether they say something like, and then I really noticed myself going down the line to two. Oh my God. And then they describe themselves in terms of levels of health and lines, and that's become their way of talking about themselves, because they're using the Enneagram as their salience landscape within. And a lot of people have forgotten that it's a tool. No, it becomes an embedded way of thinking and seeing themselves. So yeah, these applications that we download into our brain out of the ethnosphere manipulate our psychology. Spoke about that salience land. They tell us what to look for and how to think. So there's an implicit normativity as well. If you work with the Enneagram, you suddenly have this idea that you have to evolve towards this virtue and holy idea, and you kind of gear your whole orientation to reality around this particular path. You judge yourself against it. So there are lots of things that happen as a result of installing that app in your brain. And they produce feelings, and they cause us to set particular goals. And obviously there's massive value in using these psychotechnologies and cognitive apps, and they also help us to create a narrative arc for our lives and give us meaning and a sense of purpose. So here's the hero's journey, which I know has gotten many people through the darkest times of their life, is to be able to say, now I'm going through a descent. I'm going through the dark night of the soul, and I'm going to come out of it with new treasure. So that's like a psychotechnology in the form of a narrative that helps us to frame our experience and keep coherence, so that we don't just collapse in, how we might otherwise collapse if we didn't have that narrative arc. And then we've got other models, and in each chapter later on I'm going to be exploring the implications of some of these models from the mystical traditions and making the linkages. So this is the Sufi map of the stations of the soul, the stations of the heart as we progress towards spiritual enlightenment and union with God. And there's a lot of interrelationship between these different maps. They map out similar processes towards ego transcendence. And the establishment of a kind of default base in that inner observing, witnessing consciousness is something that's common to all of these models. It's about ego transcendence. It's about the transcendence of all of the buffeting by circumstance that happens emotionally and psychologically. So this is one of the models that I'm going to be looking at. And in Sufism, there's this very beautiful idea of one of the names of God is Ar-Raqib, which is the witness, the watchful, and the idea of the inner witness is that the inner witness is an instantiation of that same consciousness. It's perfectly continuous with the witnessing consciousness per se that is God, the eternal watchful consciousness that pervades the entire universe. In Christianity, that would be a kind of omnipresent omniscience. So there are these different maps that have implications for how we chart our course through life, what salience we attach to things. So if you're a Sufi, you're going to think about the inner jihad, which is overcoming the lower impulses of the soul. So you've got a conceptualization of yourself as having this thing called the nafs, and that thing needs to be purified. So you probably can think right now, what model of the psyche was I brought up with? Was I brought up with the idea of original sin? How did that frame my very sense of my living experience? And then I don't think I'm going to go through all of this, but I go through those 3 domains of experience: head, heart, hands, thinking, feeling, action, and look at some of the evidence and how it works within each of them. So from a cognitive perspective, what does that look like? Self-regulation of consciousness. And then looking at things like this, like if you're thinking about a problem, are you aware of where you're thinking about it from? The paradigmatic assumptions that you're making unconsciously, what models you're using. Like if you're using cognitive behaviorism without knowing that it's cognitive behaviorism, you're kind of robbing yourself of the other 99% of ways of thinking about reality that are much less reductive. So these are some of the metacognitive advantages. You get more perspectival awareness. So you're more aware of where your ideas come from. You're more aware of the nature of the constructs. So if I say to you, the unconscious, will you just take that on board? Or will you think about this construct of the unconscious? Does it exist? How does it exist? How does it cohere with other ideas? You have more cognitive complexity. You're able to organize ideas at a higher level. And then the meta-awareness is also being able to just purely notice what's going on in your mind. So for example, if you are ruminating, if you are stuck in a loop in your head, that you're able to notice, oh, I'm ruminating. And the inner witnessing consciousness is the one that's able to do that. So to notice the rumination, to notice the anxieties, the future planning, the stuck in the past. So the achievement of the state of being grounded in awareness is that one is able to self-distantiate from all of those different aspects. Then at an affective level, in feeling, we're talking a lot about empathy, interpersonal relationships. There's such a massive wealth of evidence on the benefits of intrapersonal awareness. There's a lot of new work on introception. I don't know how many of you have come across polyvagal theory, and there's a lot of work in the trauma domain around self-reading our affective states in the moment, and all the benefits of that from a stress management perspective, reactivity, but a huge amount of it is around interpersonal relationships. And it's about being able to know what we're feeling and naming it. So that leads to a lot more self and social awareness. And it's got a lot of advantages for self-esteem and confidence and things like that. So here's introception I just mentioned. So it's that awareness internally of what's going on in your body. There are just so many benefits from it, from a health perspective, stress management, just by paying attention to your breathing like we did at the beginning, you can instantly feel your system settling, down regulation of anxiety, and that activates our social engagement system, according to polyvagal theory. So when you relax and become present, you're much more able to connect with others. So we've also got maps around all of that, and the way in which we break down feelings, think about them, work with them, and the more self-aware we are, the more effective we're able to be. And then in the area of agency, just quickly running through that, the more self-aware we are about our agency, the more creative we can become. So some of the key points here: being aware of the fact that we can resist manipulation, that we can overcome our unconscious heuristics and act differently. We don't need to be stuck in our past automatic behaviors. And this is a huge part of the Enneagram work, as you'll all know, from Gurdjieff, thinking about the mechanical ego, where we don't have any consciousness or self-mastery, moving towards an ability to actually break out of those inflexible behaviors and be able to have more personal mastery. And this has become there's a lot of sophisticated work around this, a lot of research. The self-regulation part is especially popular in management. I don't know if any of you work with the leadership circle, but the effects of self-awareness on creativity, the ability to change habits, manage better. So here is mainly where the self-efficacy part arises, and I've put it in the domain of action. And you can see where the big benefits are. It's in things like impulse control, organization, being able to set one's life up in a way that works, task initiation. So it's all about executive ego functions at the action level. So if you're self-aware, you're able to be more effective at regulating your action, supplementing yourself where you have weaknesses with things like a diary, for example, or a shopping list. So that is the awareness in the domain of agency. And then when we get to the psychotechnologies, the convergence is happening between cognitive neurobiology, cognitive science, social neurobiology. Psychology over a long time is awareness of self-awareness, and then all these practices within mystical traditions that are also about this cultivation of a certain kind of consciousness. So we've got the mindfulness revolution that's been going on since John Kabat-Zinn, but he basically imported Buddhism and repackaged it the same way as Dan Siegel. He talks about the hub of awareness and the spoke of attention. He's basically finding Western-friendly technical jargon, inventing it for something that's been part of mystical traditions for a very, very long time. And if in the linkages I make with Christian mysticism, Evagrius Buddhism in Thich Nhat Hanh, and in the Sufi thinking, Kabir, Helminsky, Ellen Godless, the scholars that I draw on there, it's about drawing those common threads and seeing how they are converging over time. So, my cognitive scientist, John Vervaeke, that I quote all the time, he also teaches mindfulness and meditation. And he talks about developing an ecology of practices that are going to enable us to be resilient and creative at this time of what Nora Bateson calls cascading systems collapse. So these are things that are going to enable us to cope and solve problems creatively. And again, from a convergence perspective, Ken Wilber, if you listen to him talking, it's Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism. There's a real integration of ideas. Tai Chi, tons of evidence for the benefits from a neurological perspective of many of these very traditional old practices that we've known about for a long time. So in this ecology, there's embodiment, mindfulness, meditation, creative therapies. There's so much available. And one of the things that's available is this God I Am Enneagram that some of you are in love with, and I have this love-hate relationship with, where we're able to read ourselves with a very high level of differentiation, to be able to name so many things within ourselves, from a deep early childhood perspective to our behaviors in the moment, our interpersonal patterns, our ways of solving problems, our ways of reacting when we don't get what we want, etc., etc. So an incredibly comprehensive, rich and sophisticated map of the psyche, which obviously builds in a whole lot of cosmology and ideas about what the universe is, and that it's friendly and holding, and that we have this essential nature that we're able to develop towards, etc., etc. All of those assumptions come from particular places. And so we're able to start moving towards more of this meta-awareness and access all the benefits of it. And just coming back to the why, which for me is the most important, is about the transformation of the world. So Paulo Freire, one of the great heroes of the 20th century intellectually, in terms of, he didn't call it that, but this transformative creativity, our agency in the world, our ability to participate as subjects in changing the world, and the freedom that we have, the freedom of consciousness that we have in order to think about how we're going to change the world, what the world is, what's wrong about the past ways of thinking, and what are we going to do about it. So that is really my big trip. It's a very much an emancipatory and transformational agenda that drives my wish to explore this question of metacognitive awareness and self-awareness in general. So that is my story. So anyone want to ask questions or challenge me or whatever you want to do? I'd be very keen to have a conversation. Any moments for you, if there were any aha moments or any moments where you felt your body going, I hate this, I'm happy to hear the phenomenology too.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Ingrid. Can I ask you a question or can I make a comment?
Yeah. Please, go ahead.
I'm not one of your students or whatever. I'm from the religion side. I was with Maria, but I'm very interested in Cynthia Bourgeault and Richard Raw's spirituality and mysticism. And wow, are there so many, intersecting paths here that we're talking about, which has been. I'm here with Margie. Say hello, Margie. Hello.
Hi,
Ingrid.
Margie.
Margie's done her master's with Maria as well, and we both love that spirituality of those people I've mentioned.
Yes.
And of course, Richard Raw looks at the Enneagram as
Yes.
well. So
Yeah.
this has been fabulous hearing you and being able to make those connections also with what's it, Gurdjieff.
Yes. Yes.
Cynthia brings in him a lot. He was
Yes.
one of her teachers,
Yes.
and on the mindfulness. She draws on that 3 centers of awareness.
Yes.
So this is so super hearing you and seeing you coming from a slightly different angle, but seeing the where these truths converge about
Exactly.
growing in awareness and thinking.
Yes. So for me, that's
Thank
the
you.
thing, is where do we find the common threads? So for me, that's the element of how I derive something that I think is of value, by stripping away and finding those common threads. And my chapter on Christian mysticism very much draws on Rohr, and that Meister Eckhart, his tradition going back to Evagrius and Origen and Neoplatonism, which is a deep foundation of the Enneagram cosmology. I also love Cynthia Bourgeois, so I think you'll like my chapter on Christianity.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Are you going to continue with these?
Yeah.
Are you going to cover that?
Yeah. So the chapter
good.
on Christian mysticism looks at this idea of the ground of being. And that's part of the Enneagram cosmology and map of the psyche, is that there is this universal presence or being. And they don't like to use theistic language or talk about it as God, but it's presence. And our being is grounded in that being. So these are the Christian mystical models that come together. They happen to inform the Enneagram, but they're alternative ways of conceptualizing our own being. So thanks for bringing that up. I didn't mention Raw, but he's my go-to for the Christian mystical tradition.
Yes. Thank you. And thank you for bringing in that wider dimension for us. We can only learn.
Yeah.
And we can only grow broader by doing that.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Karen. And
Thank
Margie,
you.
who else wants to? Karen, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Ingrid. What a great presentation. My question from a coaching perspective is, what is the literature saying about how do you ignite somebody who is not self-aware onto the path of starting to become self-aware?
I'm sure that you have a brilliant answer for that with your experience and depth. So I'm going to throw the question back at you, and I'm going to ask you personally, what catalyzed self-awareness for you, and introspection and reflection? What initiated that journey for you? And then in your practice as a coach, what have you seen really work to catalyze a kind of awakening for somebody where they begin to notice their inner life and work with that? So those 2 questions, like for you personally, can you remember a moment in which you suddenly awoke to your own awareness?
I think that question is the more difficult one and the longer one. So I'm going to answer the other one about what I'm currently doing. When I send somebody away with the self-observation and they come back and they just have no idea what I'm talking about and they haven't done it, then I'll do something with them in the session. So they'll say something and then I'll reflect back what they're saying and then inquire about it. So the process of reflective inquiry. And then what's particularly useful is to get them to become self-aware of what is happening right now in your body. Are you aware of posture, breathing? Emotions for many is more difficult, and often even more difficult is, how am I thinking?
Yeah.
Because they can tell me what they're thinking, but how are you thinking? What and I might assist with fast, slow, clear, jumbled, starting to get a sense of perspective to describe. But I'm really keen, it's a struggle. And I would love to know what other sources to look at, where I can get some inspiration for in other ways to ignite people on this path of self-observation.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. That was such a lovely articulation. And I think that's part of what me doing this research is wanting to help coaches to ignite. And that's an interesting metaphor, ignite. There are lots of metaphors around seeing, light, enlightenment. So yeah, how do we catalyze it? So when I'm doing all my interviews with people, those are the kinds of questions I'm asking. Like, what happened to make you experience yourself differently? And people are able to speak about moments in which they had a reframing experience or a shift in attention, a shift in awareness. Like that meditation I did at the beginning of the session, for me, that was something that shifted my sense of self and awareness, was to think about things arising in awareness in their own place, that my awareness is not in my head. My awareness is the whole universe, and things are arising in it in their own place. So for me, that's a fundamental shift in consciousness. And it happens through language. That by encountering ideas of Sufi mysticism, we suddenly start thinking of ourselves as different. By encountering Christian mystical tradition ideas where they say our being is grounded in the ground of all being, you can kind of almost feel your whole self reorienting around that idea. And like Evagria speaks about, the mind begins to see its own light. So encountering these ideas transform our awareness, and that's part of the process that I find so fascinating, and why it's so important what tools we use. You know, if you subscribe to behaviorism, you are rendering your inner landscape utterly bleak. And do you want to do that? I mean, it's sometimes helpful. You know, I might stop biting my nails, but I don't want my inner world to feel like a shopping mall, you know, or whatever your worst place on earth is, fill in the missing word. So, yeah, I think I would like to finish this PhD with what can we do to really ethically, kindly, and gently help people in establishing this inner home, in the inner observer, and be highly conscious of the ethical pitfalls of imposing a model on someone's self-concept. Norman, your hand's up.
Yes, thank you very much. That was very exciting. It's just a pity some of it just went over my head, and it's because of this that I would like to find out what sort of background do you come from, because I'm trying also to deal with those things, you know, get into the nature of the self and the nature of reality, but I'm coming from not mysticism but Pentecostalism, because then they proceed from certain presuppositions, for instance, that the human is tripartite, body, soul, and spirit.
Yes.
Such things. So, because if you are going to use an emic perspective, for instance, you're going to take the views of the participants, but you would also like to step back and then kind of gauge that against some perhaps more objective, you know, yardstick. Psychology, maybe you do that, but I would like to really know about your sources. What kind of background would somebody need to be able to get into that?
To grapple with reality.
Yes.
Oh, I don't know if I can answer that.
Well, do you have psychological training, or what kind of other training does it take to then be able to, you know,
to navigate these different paradigms? I think it's largely an effect of my personal history, that I like to step between different worldviews And I think a lot of it comes from my early childhood. So my father was a rabid atheist and my mother was a Christian. And if my father ever saw me carrying a Bible, he'd say, "What the fairy tales? Why don't you go and get Grimm's fairy tales?" And so I grew up in an environment in which the realities didn't cohere or meet at all. And so part of my path has been, okay, I want to find the truth. And the best way for me to do that is to explore every different perspective on reality and see what's common. And so I've been doing that probably since I was 5 years old. So I've studied a bit of psychology, development studies, English literature, philosophy. It's like a big mush of things that I've been exposed to. And I follow a lot of cognitive scientists and neurobiologists on YouTube. So I'm always on the lookout for where do things come together. And for me, they do come together in this question of awareness. And everything else is changeable and fluid and a construction. But this pure awareness, the language is not universal, but the experience of consciousness seems to be pretty universal from everything I've come across. So that's kind of how I landed up being such a paradigm hopper. Yeah, but it's also beautiful to just embrace a cosmology. You have to have one. So, you know, be a Sufi, be a Christian, throw yourself into it completely. I don't know, that's my approach. I don't know if I answered your question in
You
any
did. Thank
way,
you. Thank you
Amanda.
so much. Thank
Is there
you.
anything you want to add or unpack? Because I'm not sure I answered you.
You did absolutely. The reason why it was so intriguing, it's something that you can also bounce your ideas from, because like I said, it's the thrust of my research also in the PhD. It's try to bring in, such perspective, neuroscience, awareness. Is it something that can exist independently of the body? Such things. So parapsychology and all those things are coming into the whole mix.
And that's fascinating, because if you think about something like the tangible somatic experience of the Holy Spirit, if you're Pentecostalist, I'm assuming that
Yes.
that you've had that experience of a descent of a tangible force. And how do you make sense of that? So it's beautiful that you're exploring that, and it sounds like the phenomenology of it as well, hey? Of the experience of reality from a Pentecostalist perspective. In the Gurdjieff system, that very self-same energy is called hydrogen 12, which I find absolutely hilarious. Anyway, that's a whole other story. Oh, God. Fran, you've got your hand up.
Thanks. Yeah, I didn't have a question. I just had a whole lot of reflections and aha moments. And I sort of, as I was looking at your slides, I zoomed in on self-reflection and, no, not self-reflection, self-regulation and self-efficacy. And those two, I see one as a process and one as an outcome. And I sort of started thinking about how I think of these two things, because I feel like a person who has a high drive towards self-regulation. And yet I've realized that I don't view myself as highly efficacious sometimes. And it was the first time I sort of looked at the two together and thought, why do I think of these things as mutually exclusive? That if we are self-regulating beings, that doesn't make us effective. And I sort of started thinking about what are all the assumptions underneath there, and am I identifying this mental model that says self-regulation doesn't lead to self-efficacy? In other words, and maybe it comes back to that whole worldview of the self as the agent acting on the ecosystem. You know, that man is not nature. We don't need to be self-aware to be effective. We need to be almost deadened towards our needs for self-regulation, and the agent doesn't need to self-regulate, and that can be a limiting belief. You know, I can see myself and encourage other people to see, you know, self-regulation as part of being effective, not just, you know, arriving at a point of feeling okay with myself is often seen as not enough in the world. We still have to be striving and achieving and all that sort of thing. And I also sort of linked it to that whole, well, I think I've mentioned it already, that worldview of being external to the ecosystem. Yeah, we need to come back to, again, falling into that trap of forgetting that we are ecosystems in ourselves, and self-regulation, other regulation. Yeah, anyway, that was just, and it was quite personal to me as a person who identifies as a self-regulator. That to see, you know, to be able to see I can see that as a source of self-efficacy.
That's interesting, and to be able to differentiate within this idea of self-regulation and self-efficacy or self-mastery. What does that mean for you in your living embodied experience? You know, John Vervaeke speaking about optimal grip. How are you moment to moment striving to get an optimal grip on your life? And what feedback are you using to inform how that's going? And are you responsive to the signals that are coming back at you from reality? So if you are self-regulating, and you know you've got some normative superego that's driving you to be super conscientious, is that optimal grip? And being able to say, okay, in this embedded, fluid, responsive agent arena relationship, being able to notice that particular form of self-control. And maybe that's not self-efficacy. Maybe it is. Maybe being really conscientious and goal-oriented is really helpful, you know, or in some areas of life. But being responsive in a relationship where, you know, your partner says, let's go away for the weekend, and you struggle with spontaneity. Maybe optimal grip is about knowing what strategy is appropriate in what context, what is relevant right now. And that's something that Sufism is really beautiful at, because it says the real presents you with certain things, and the real, capital R, is God, and that is the universe. Everything that you ever encounter is God. And things arrive, and you have that moment in which you can respond to the real. So no matter what, you embrace it as the gift of your existence, but then you're able to engage with it in a particular way. And you know, if somebody says to you, let's go away for the weekend, the real is presenting you with something, and what does that mean? So that's how you'd see it if you were in a Sufi cosmology. If you're in a cognitive behaviorist model, you're probably going to think stimulus response, these are the rules of how I should operate. So I think the more self-awareness you have about what's happening real time, and where is that self-control impulse coming from in yourself, in your body? Is it driven by anxiety, or does it feel like you're at ease and you're relaxed and you're in flow? That's that beautiful the Hungarian dude. Csikszentmihalyi.
Yeah.
I don't know how many times I've memorized his name, but the ability to notice the difference between when you're in flow and when you're not in flow, and knowing what gets you back into flow. That's part of self-awareness as well, is why am I feeling so disconnected? And being able to engage in a process and maybe breathe. That's one of the self-regulation processes. Oh, I'm going to breathe. Oh, I feel much better. Okay, now I can start my work. So So that fluidity and responsivity is actually at the core. Is that helpful?
Thank you. Yes, it is. It's so helpful because it's that other underlying point about resilience being responsiveness, and the whole point of all of this, of metacognition, of upgrading our consciousness, apart from, you know, being integrative, is to be responsive and self-regulation. You made me think that, you know, if I'm seeing what I'm doing is self-regulating, but it's not sort of in the service of being responsive and flexible, then maybe it is more of a super ego, self-control, conscientious drive, because those behaviors can be addictive as well. But I mean, yeah, that's maybe going down a side track, but
Yeah. But that's
yeah.
exactly it, because addictions and habits that arise compulsively we're not aware of. So the more awareness we have, the more able we are to see, is this rigid, like you're saying, is this rigid and inflexible and just a recipe and an addiction? Or is this how I want to be right now, and what reality is inviting, and also what reality needs? Like, you know, in those OSC processes, you say, what wants to happen in the room from an ecosystemic process perspective? So you don't force an agenda if you're facilitating in that way. You say, okay, what wants to happen now? What would be helpful for the process? So you go into a process awareness that is very soft and fluid.
Thank you. This was a wonderful session. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Anyone else want to say something? I haven't kept up with the chat at all. I think lots of people just needing to drop off and say goodbye. Anyone else want to engage, ask, talk? I'm very happy to discuss. Marlene, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks so much, Ingrid. It's just amazing. A lot of things to reflect on and to digest. I mean, I've worked with Ken Wilber's stuff years ago, and I got so tired of it. And now you're reconnecting, you know, me back into it, and that there's actually now a third tier, because I stopped when he was still working on the second tier. But yeah, I just feel this is so important now, going through the whole COVID experience, and not to look at the band-aid issues, but to dig deeper in our own souls and what work is really needed from each individual and collective for us to move forward for the health and the well-being of this planet. I think this kind of processes is so important that we all need to be exposed to, and I think that is missing. So your work is very important, and we need to get you engaged in other platforms for people to start making these connections. We all need it desperately. Thanks.
Thanks so much. What stood out for you personally, Madeleine? I'm interested to hear, because we don't really know each other.
I mean, I'm a slow learner, so that's why I need the PowerPoint slides and the recording to replay and relive it and to make my own notes. But yeah, and because I was kind of multitasking in between with other work, apology for that. But yes, I think the one thing that stood out is the ease that you started the session with, of doing the meditation, the body connection, the breathing, and that's often that we forget to do and use in any way that we engage, whether it's in class or processes or workshops and so on. Instead of just focusing on the process, and instead of focusing on the task, we need to work on those subtle processes. And yes, like Ken Wilber, and bringing in the other spiritual and religious traditions, you know, for showing the connection and the uniqueness and the language that might be different, but actually they all connect in different ways. So yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. So I'm lecturing in social work at UJ, and yeah, so that's my background. Thanks.
How cool. That's so cool. Yay. If you ever want me to come and talk to your students, I would love to.
Thank you. I will take you up on that, Ingrid.
I'd love to, or even do a workshop with them about their own self-awareness, because that's a big part of being a healer.
Absolutely, because besides the social work students, we also have the community development and leadership course.
Cool.
And for that, run internship programs and projects. And this kind of grounding is so necessary for our
Yes.
students in the internship.
Yay,
Thank
I'd
you.
love to do that. And it wouldn't be a big PowerPoint dump. I'd actually do some processes. So let's talk about it.
Super, thank you.
Lekker. Cool, cool. Anyone else want to say anything? It was lovely to meet you, Norman. Tell me about your research a bit more.
Well, I would like to, my aim is to look at because it's how do I even say it? I'm looking at the resurrection of Jesus in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and then my focus is on the people that claim to have seen him back then in the first century.
Yeah.
So this has been interpreted in different ways, and hallucinations is one of the theories, but that has also been brought into conversation with some medical theories, like the out-of-body experiences when people are undergoing, for instance, when you have a cardiac arrest, for instance, and then you begin to see things that you would not otherwise see, you know, that kind of perception, and so I'm bringing that together. Could it be that this is a consciousness that is apart from the body, which is normal to everybody? So I'm bringing Pentecostalism, because Pentecostals believe that they see visions even today.
Yeah, yeah.
So what are they seeing? Can you reconstruct that using Pentecostalism, neuroscience, African traditional religions? Because African traditional religions claim to be able to engage with ancestors that have since died.
Yeah.
So what is taking place when that is happening? And I'm using all these experiences, like contemporary spiritual experiences, contemporary, what can I call them? Cultural activities.
Yeah.
That claim to have access to another realm of existence.
Wonderful.
So at the center of it, is it possible that human beings are more than just physicality? Is it possible that reality is more than that which meets the eye? Can people travel to, realms of existence that are beyond the natural world that we see? So it's quite something.
So it sounds as though, like, I'm looking at ways of seeing the experience of the self. You're looking at multiple perspectives on this encounter, this with a different form of consciousness, and all the different perspectives on that. It's very, very nice topic. Eh? That's cool.
It's what I got intrigued with as you presented is the gut, the heart, and the
mind.
The mind.
Yeah.
So it is those presuppositions that, for instance, that gives the Pentecostals this basis on which to say, you see, I'm not just the body.
Yeah, yeah.
There is consciousness apart from the body. A consciousness, they're what are referred to as soul journeys.
Yeah.
That a person can move out of himself. Yeah. So basically, what some scholars are claiming is that it's not so much the human brain that we have not really understood. It's the nature of the self. Yeah. That's what they're saying. Simply because if a person is lying there and they are unconscious because of a medical procedure, for instance, that's taking place, and when they come to, then they tell you this is what was happening, something that could not happen without consciousness.
Yeah,
So,
and if you listen to all the recordings and the videos of near-death experiences, I'm sure that could be a similar exploration, is you have an experience and then you try and make sense of it. And what language and what conceptual framework and what tradition are you using to make sense of an actual experience? So the question of hallucination is the experience wasn't real. Okay, so
yes.
that's one model. And if you put that aside and you say, no, the experience was real and not just subjective, like everyone in the room felt the presence of the Holy Spirit. So now what? How do we understand that? So I think that's it's a very interesting question. If it's not an hallucination, then how are we making sense of the experience? What are the other ways of making sense of it?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to look at. But the thing is, now what I try to problematize, I don't know whether I've been successful at that, because up to now it's been like this is the figment of your imagination, is the human brain that is playing tricks on you. That's hallucination, of course.
Yeah.
But if a Pentecostal practitioner tells you what is happening there in South Africa right now, and they tell you this is exactly what's happening in the United States, in Dallas, Texas, for instance, what is happening? And hallucinations have been thought of as pathological conditions.
Yeah.
But in Pentecostals, visions are actually life enriching.
Yeah. So
The
I think
element
that's
of
wonderful. If you can take the experience and say these are the different perspectives on the experience, and if there's a rationalist empiricist perspective that says it's a medical condition or an hallucination or psychosis, that's one way of seeing it. And there are multiple ways of interpreting the experience. And I remember my brother did his PhD in psychology, and his supervisor was Stan Lipschitz, and he spoke about the difference between mysticism and psychosis. And I think that's pretty much what you're talking about, is how do we frame experience? Like if you think about twasa, in a Western medical model, twasa is an illness and you need to be treated. Whereas in African traditional society, you're going to be taken and you're going to go through an initiation and you're going to become a healer. So, these different cosmologies and worldviews radically determine how...
I would like to request for if you could recommend for me, because what I'm just, in terms of the psychological aspect of it, it's just I don't have any psychological, so I'm looking for material that is light, that I could because already I think I'll be submitting my PhD in October, but subsequent to that I would like to major on religious experiences, especially. Yes.
Wow,
So
there's some amazing stuff on the psychology of religious experience. And I have someone whom I've worked with a little bit who wrote a book on what he calls living transcendence. And kind of enlightenment experiences are what he works with a lot, an Israeli scholar. And I think he'd be the person for me to introduce you to, who'd be able to give you key readings in the psychology of religious experience and mystical experience, the psychology of mystical experience. It's fascinating. It's really wonderful.
So that's I'll be doing that with, I don't know whether you know, there's Peter Crawford at UNISA. He gets into a lot of that. So he's the guy that I'm going to be studying under. His majors in religious experiences.
Nice. Oh, wow.
But I want to just put myself to speed. I send you a message. I don't know whether you will, because I asked for not only for the recording, but I asked for the recording, but I'm just going to ask for any literature that you think I could also. But I sent you my email address there. I don't know whether you see it.
Okay. I think probably Maria, and I've got a co-supervisor. His name's Peter van der Zwaan, and he seems to be quite an expert in the psychology of religion. So,
Okay.
it's not really my focus area, and I don't have a background in religion studies. I come from critical theory, literature development studies. I kind of ended up here somehow because it's been an interest my whole life. But
Okay.
in terms of the layers and layers of scholarship around this, I don't think I'm the right person to give you guidance on it.
Okay.
I mean, I could probably tell you within Christianity, within Sufism, about the mystical dimensions, but you need a more critical overview. This guy, Amir, won't you put your phone number? Oh, you've put your email address, eh?
I put my email address. I don't know whether, sometimes I think I do something, then I don't follow through it. And I don't know whether are you looking at it right now? Did you?
Yeah, no. Okay, there we go. Shoko Norman 890.
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'm going to connect you with Amir, and you'll be able to ask him, because we were in a little research group. It was wonderful. And I think he'll be able to give you some really good stuff.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
It was awesome. It was awesome. Just a bit of it just flew over my head. It was just
stress.
it must have
quite
taken.
new material. I mean, when I
Okay.
first discovered it, John Vervaeke particularly, I'd watch one of his lectures and then go away for about a month and almost be like spaced out from the stuff he was saying. So yeah, I know this stuff can be quite disorienting at times.
But once I go through it again, I'll be able to, I think, distill a few things that I can also use in my own work. Thank you so very much.
Great, such a pleasure, Norman. It was wonderful to meet you.
This pleasure is mine. Thank you.
Okay, my dear. Speak to you again.
All
Hey?
right.
I'll send you something.
Okay.
Ciao,
Thank
ciao.
you.
Bye.
Bye.